the ABCs of invasive species organizations. I would like to introduce Chuck Bargeron, who has been with the University of Georgia for over 20 years with work focusing on invasive species and information technology. Recently, Chuck has focused on mapping invasive species and tools for early detection and rapid response. He has led development of 66 smartphone applications, including the first apps for the U.S. Forest Service and National Park Service. Websites that he's designed have received over 1.7 billion hits since 2002. In 2013, he was appointed to the National Invasive Species Advisory Council and elected as chair in 2018. Chuck serves on the NASMA Board of Directors, and we're happy to have Chuck here to present, again, the ABCs of invasive species organizations.
Oh, thanks, Hannah. And I will say that, this is meant to be informative, but it's also meant to be a little bit fun. So please take it as that. And I'll say that I'm trying to give an overview of all the different groups doing invasive species work, and I'm sure that I have left one out. And if I did leave your organization out, then I'll have all my information at the end, and you can send me an email. Let me know, and I'll make sure that next time this presentation is given, that your group or the group you're involved in is not left out. And I'm going to also say that I'm not necessarily endorsing any of these groups. I hate to be politically correct in that way, but I'll say I'm not endorsing any of these groups. I'm just, here's what they do, here's who they are. In most cases, I didn't point out people unless they were really instrumental or it was the board of directors that was obvious as part of this. And I will give credit to Damon Waite, who is now the director of the North Carolina Botanical Gardens. Probably 10 plus years ago, he gave a version of this presentation and was kind of the inspiration for this moving forward. And so with that, I'm going to jump into it. And please ask any questions or like I said, provide any comments. So when we talk about invasive species organizations, I get who I work for and what I do gets messed up a lot because there's a bunch of different products and groups that are all tied under the University of Georgia Center for Invasive Species and Ecosystem Health. So whether it's Bugwood, whether it's EdMaps, the I've Got One app, there's Forestry Images, invasive.org, all of that stuff is all under the UGA Center's role, of which I'm the co-director now. So just want to clear up when I'm talking about acronyms. Sometimes your own organization can be the worst about having a lot of different acronyms. So 20 years ago, there was an executive order that was signed by President Clinton, and then another follow-up one done at the end of the Obama administration that set up a National Invasive Species Council within the U.S. government. And that group was set up as the secretaries and administrators of 13 federal departments and now also including 3 White House offices. And so when you talk about the National Invasive Species Council, or NISC, NISC is made up of the secretaries. So if NISC was to meet, it would be the secretaries or administrators of those federal departments, and I'll pull that list up, that would be sitting around the room and talking about invasive species issues. That obviously does not happen very often, just because of the level of folks that you're talking about. But and so because of that, it ends up being other staff within those agencies that will get together, talk about ways they can collaborate, look at, in the past, this group has drafted the National Invasive Species Management Plan, and they have looked at things like interdepartmental budgets and other ways to work together. The Department of Interior, Department of Agriculture, and Department of Commerce co-chair the council. And so the council has staff that works for them, and I've highlighted a few of them here. Um, there's been a few different directors in the years that this has worked. Stosh Virgil is currently the acting director, and they are really the staff that helps, you know, guide the discussions, manages the advisory committee, which I'm going to talk about next, kind of reports on accomplishments, helps coordinate development of the management plan, and facilitates communication between different groups. So whether it's a National Invasive Species Council staff or National Invasive Species Council secretariat, those are the staff, those are the folks that work at that to support that interdepartmental group. Then there's the Invasive Species Advisory Committee, or ISAC. ISAC was, according to its charter, was set up to provide information and advice for consideration by the council on invasive species related issues. It is set up to include representations from state, territorial, tribal, local governments, academic institutions, non-government organizations, and the private sector. It is a federal, is chartered under the Federal Advisory Committee Act, and previously it held two meetings a year. Now it only holds one meeting a year. The meetings are open to the public, and the minutes are publicly available. As I think she mentioned in my introduction, I'm currently chair of this group. We have 12 members that are currently on the ISAC committee, and their names are listed here. Blaine Parker, who's with the Columbia Intertribal Fish Group, is the vice chair. And myself, Bill Hyatt, who's just recently retired from Connecticut Department of Environmental Protection, Janice McFarland with Syngenta, and Carol Okada. We are both finishing up our second terms in May, and will not, and our terms will be over. We're termed out in terms of how long we can be on it. This group, I tried to include upcoming meetings is when I talk about the different groups. This group is meeting next week at the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indians. So if you're in DC next Tuesday through Thursday, then feel free to join that meeting. A few things that ISAC has done recently. They made some recommendations based on stakeholder and other feedback back in March of 2018. And part of that was for NISC and the agencies to meet more regularly, help streamline federal regulatory processes, facilitate open access to data, support cooperative invasive species management areas. I'm going to talk more about those in a few minutes. Expand the use of the Good Neighbor Authority. Look at ways to fund rapid response. That's something that is always seems to be a problem, having ways to do that. Continue to work and build coordination between states and tribes as well as the federal government. Explore some international and regional coordination and support those groups. Provide, help promote and develop innovative tools and technologies for working with invasive species. Always public engagement, getting the public involved. And then finally, look at the recommendations that have come from the previous papers. Over the past almost 20 years, there's been a lot of papers that have come out and a lot of good information in these. So, I would recommend all of you going and looking at some of these recommendations that have come out over the past, since 2006. There's some good information there and some good resources that can be addressed. Even going down to things as simple as, the definition of invasive species. When you're talking about at the federal, U.S. federal level, there's also a handful of different interagency groups, FICMANU, the Federal Interagency Committee on Management of Noxious and Exotic Weeds, it, as well as the Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force. Those are both groups that have been around for a long time, predating the National Invasive Species Council, and really are where the coordination occurs in a lot of cases between the different federal agencies, between Park Service, BLM, Forest Service, between those groups. That's where they get together and talk to each other. And more recently, there was a committee put together on invasive terrestrial animals and pathogens to kind of make sure that cooperation was happening both on the weed side and on the animal and disease side. Another good resource that so the website for the Invasive Species Council Secretariat and ISAC is invasivespecies.gov. But another great website with a lot of good information is the National Invasive Species Information Center, which is held under the Department of Agriculture. And this is a great place to look for upcoming events, to look for species profiles and other resources. And that website is invasivespeciesinfo.gov. And I would suggest everybody taking a look at it. It's a real good resource that's out there. So continuing with the acronyms, we had NISC, we had ISAC, we had FICMANU and ITAP and ANSTF. So the next one is NISAW. So NISAW is the National Invasive Species Awareness Week. This is, I think, coming close to the 20th year of it as well. I think we figured out it was the first National Invasive Weed Awareness Week, NIWA is what it was called, was held in 1999. And what NISAW and NIWA have looked like over the years have changed as times have changed. But this is also next week. The ISAC meeting is going to be held as part of that group, as part of that meeting. And there will also be some webinars hosted and some talks that will be held at the House and Senate, as well as local events all over the country. And so if you go to nisaw.org, there's a map that shows you some of those local events and things going on. So again, that's next week, and a long-standing activity that is out there. So looking at, and I'm bringing up state councils here because after the National Invasive Species Council was put together, a lot of states put together their own state councils, kind of modeled off of what the National Council was. So in a lot of cases, it's the agencies working together at the state level. In other cases, it's made up of agencies as well as nonprofits, academia, and private citizens. So it really depends on state by state how those exactly look. But in some states they're more active than others. It just really depends on how the state works. In some cases they're more formal than others as well. But a lot of work's done at the state level, and sometimes that is split between the State Department of Ag, the State Department of Natural Resources are similar, and even in some states like Georgia, there's a State Forestry Commission that has regulatory authority and does a good bit of invasive species work as well. So, at that state level, that's a piece there that I didn't want to leave out. Another group that is a partnership of different environmental organizations that was established in 2003 and was really built to provide feedback, to provide education, to do that kind of outreach, is the National Environmental Coalition on Invasive Species. As you can see, it's made up of a lot of different groups, including some I'm going to talk about through the rest of this presentation, but some of them more of like the Nature Conservancy, National Wildlife Federation, Environmental Law Institute. So, groups that may do invasive species work, but not necessarily part of their core mission. Another group that I've been involved with for a long time is the National Association of Invasive Plant Councils. It was established in 1995 as the National Association of Exotic Pest Plant Councils, and with time, names have changed. And this is a group that it started out with Florida, Tennessee, California, and the Pacific Northwest, and has really kind of grown to fill in since then. And it's really as much the board of this group meets on a monthly basis with the kind of executive board meets on a monthly basis, and then the full committee, meets once a quarter on the phone, and it's as much about sharing information about what's going on and what you can learn from different what's going on across the country. Here's a map of kind of where there's coverage of these exotic plant councils or exotic pest plant councils. In the Southeast Exotic Pest Plant Council is actually going away in favor of the state chapters. There's a lot of activity going on with the state chapters now, and so there was really no reason to have another organization. So there could be a national one, and then there could be the individual state chapters. So some of the things that National Association of Invasive Plant Councils does is webinars. That they're hosting the webinars next week as part of the NISAR event. And so there's going to be 4 webinars next week that you can attend and find out online. I think they're all at 3:00 in the Eastern time next week. They've also been working on ways to list invasive plants. They started out working through an ASTM standard to do this. That kind of got difficult to keep moving forward. So they've been working with folks with APHIS doing risk assessments as well as others to kind of figure out ways to make sure we list things the same, and whether that's how we assess species, when we talk about this, making sure that what we talk about in Georgia and what we talk about in Florida is the same, and we're talking about things using the same terminology. And so, the EPSIs have throughout history come up with these watch lists, and when you have these and you try to combine them, that's when things can get complicated. And so, the EPSIs and IPSIs have really made a big push to standardize how, when they talk about invasive plants in natural areas, usually, what that means and how they're listed and how they're done. Another group that was established in 2010, and it kind of came off of a few different efforts, is the North American Invasive Species Network. And again, like some of these other groups I've talked about, it's really just a group to share information. The concept was, let's get together some different academic groups who are primarily doing outreach type work, and let's get them together and talk about ways we can do things better. And there's a group, Canabio in Mexico, that is really looking at ecosystems as a whole and biodiversity as a whole, but they have a good invasive species program. And so they're part of this from the Mexico side. We've also got the Invasive Species Center that's in Ontario in Canada that's part of this. And then just different centers at University of Florida, my group at the University of Georgia, group at Colorado State, Texas, Midwest, as well as the New York Invasive Species Research Institute is the newest member to join as part of this. This group, in collaboration with the International Planning Committee, hosted the first North American Invasive Species Forum, which was previously the Weeds Across Borders meeting in 2017 in Savannah, Georgia. and really a way to bring together things to talk about policy and talk about ways we can do things better across the three countries. That meeting is hopefully going to happen again. It's probably not going to be in 2019, but probably in 2020. And the hope is that Canabio will be hosting that meeting in Mexico. The next group, which is the group that's actually hosting this webinar, is the North American Invasive Species Management Association. This is a great group. It is a membership, open membership kind of group where you join. Like a lot of other organizations, is supported somewhat by membership. They have an annual conference that I'll talk about in a minute. They are now hosting the Play Clean Go standards, which is a great outreach tool, doing webinars such as this one, also doing certification programs and standards programs, both on invasive species mapping, as well as weed-free forage and weed-free gravel. And this group is lucky enough to have Belle Bergner as its executive director and Hannah Bowers, who introduced me, as a communication and program meeting. And having those positions in place really helps drive the board of directors and keeps things moving, allows grant opportunities to be pursued, and really continue to build the organization. And here's just a kind of a mugshot of the latest board of directors, as well as kind of the Play Clean Go information that you hopefully have all seen at some point in the past. And the NASMA is going to be hosting a joint meeting with the New York Invasive Species Research Institute, focusing on connecting science and action. The call for abstracts is out now. The meeting will be held late September, early October in Sarasota Springs, New York. So if you're interested, now's the time to get on and submit your abstract for that meeting. So the next level of really invasive species organizations, I'm going to talk about a few more, but when you really get down to the work on the ground, a lot of that is being done by groups called cooperative invasive species management areas, cooperative weed management areas, or partnerships for regional invasive species management, PRISMs. Those are really the groups that are the ones that are doing the on-the-ground work, doing the group, doing the local level work. Usually they have ways where they can work across boundaries and borders. They're always a mix of the landowners, whether they're federal, state, county, or NGO, or even private. And there's been some great success with some of these groups. In New York, each of the whole state's covered with them. And in Florida, the whole state's covered with them. And then they've spread out across with throughout the country to cover different areas and different groups. Really good concept, and I'm gonna come back to that in just a few minutes. I want to mention a couple other nonprofits that are involved with invasive species. One of them is the Reduce Risk from Invasive Species Coalition. Rick Otis is the current president of that organization. They're based out of DC. They work closely with the Invasive Species Caucus within the House. They also have been planning and promoting the Invasive Species Awareness Week, as well as they do a award ceremony and congressional reception as part of that organization. So a group really DC focused and trying to help educate about the invasive species issue. Wildlife Forever is a group out of Minnesota. They are they host and have built the Clean Drain Dry initiative, which is a aquatic focused outreach campaign. They also partner with us on the Wild Spotter campaign, and are looking at ways to conserve wildlife, and part of that being invasive species. They've some great educational materials, as well as partnering with groups to actually have cleaning tools that are available at boat launches, so you can clean the boats after they come out of the water. So another group, another nonprofit that is focused on invasive species. The Continental Dialogue on Non-Native Forest Insects and Diseases. Another group that kind of came out of the Nature Conservancy, but have built a lot of partnerships. They meet annually, usually with the Partners in Community Forestry meeting, which is going to be in Cleveland, Ohio this year. And this group is where the Don't Move Firewood campaign really grew out of. And so hopefully all of y'all are familiar with Don't Move Firewood. This is a campaign managed by the Nature Conservancy, but a lot of different partners have worked on it and supported it. And just in preparing the update of this presentation, they've got some really cool new infographics like the one on the screen about firewood and the impact and how it's moved. So I would encourage you to check that out and learn and see the opportunities that are there. Again, like the Play Clean Go, like the Clean Drain Dry, this is another partnership-based group where we're trying to keep, it's a different message, trying to keep the same marketing materials out there when it goes out and the public consumes it. As part of that, they have a firewood outreach coordinating initiative, and that is a separate entity from Don't Move Firewood, but is there to support it. They do webinars, have newsletters, and I would encourage all of you to sign up for that as kind of a professional development venue for more about firewood and the Don't Move Firewood campaign. And this slide, somehow I messed up and got out of order, but this is where the SISMA, CWMA, and PRISMs exist throughout the U.S. At one point, there has been as many as 300 of these, some of them more active than others, but it's great to see a map and really see the spread throughout. And it's a little unfair because Texas, through their Texas Invaders program, actually have these regional groups that function very much like SISMAs or CWMAs that probably should be included as part of this. Another group that really is focused on getting states together with the federal agencies and really has a productive outcome is the Western Weed Coordinating Committee. They meet annually in Las Vegas, usually in late November, early December. But this is where the groups that are working at the state level in those Western states get together and talk about how they can do things better. And a lot of great initiatives have come out of that. I'm going to talk about one of them in a few minutes, but this is the state noxious weed coordinators. And if you're from the East, it's kind of a hard thing sometimes to understand that, the Western states, because of the history of noxious weeds, most every state has a state level noxious weed coordinator, and they also have county level noxious weed coordinators, and that infrastructure. There's a lot of great work that goes on, and sometimes us living on the East Coast don't realize all of that's going on. So another group, and I think Bill's actually on the webinar. So it's a good that I can give a shout out to the work that the Western Governors Association has done recently. Their chair is the governor from Hawaii, and one of their main initiatives under his chairmanship is biosecurity and invasive species. And so from the Western U.S. standpoint, they've held a series of webinars and as well as in-person meetings talking about different aspects of biosecurity and invasive species and their impacts. And so Western Governors Association, another one of those groups that's out there and doing a lot to build in the momentum behind us working on this problem of invasive species. The USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture, NIFA, has groups, 4 groups throughout the U.S. that are regional centers for integrated pest management. And there's a Western center, a North Central center, a Northeastern center, and a Southern center. And those are groups that, again, you kind of outside what we normally think of about invasive species, but interesting in looking at these groups. Part of what they do is, IPM. You need IPM for managing these invasive species, and so these center objectives are to build partnerships, build information networks, look at ways inside the region and outside the region to build collaboration and cooperation. And each of the centers have signature programs. And what's very interesting when you look across this at all the different signature programs for the IPM centers, that each of them have an invasive species as one of their signature programs. And that was something that their individual advisory boards, their individual groups, as they were putting together their most recent plan of works, all identified as something that was important was invasive species. So the IPM centers are there. They all have grant programs where they fund different research and different outreach and working groups. And so a very important group to include in the conversation about invasive species organizations. A meeting that not really an organization, but a meeting of invasive species information is the Innovations in Invasive Species Conference. This year will be the 3rd year of this meeting. It's going to take place in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. The first 2 meetings have been in Nashville, Tennessee. And so this upcoming meeting is a partnership between Invasive Plant Control Incorporated, Pacific Northwest Invasive Plant Council, and the Northern Rockies Invasive Plant Council. And so another good opportunity to learn more about invasive species, but not really an organization, an organization having a meeting, but a meeting this bringing different organizations together. On the aquatic side, I think it's every 2 years is the International Conference on Aquatic Invasive Species. It was down in Florida in 2017. It's going to be in Montreal, Canada in 2019. And I think the call for papers for that meeting is still available. So iCase is the name that group goes by. Another initiative and another good opportunity on the aquatic invasive side of things. This is my random slide of other things. There are other organizations and some meetings I wanted to mention. There's an international meeting that has moved around the world on ecology and management of alien plant invasions. That meeting happens every 2 years and is going to be in Prague this year. I think that meeting was maybe in 2003 or something like that. It was in the U.S. and held as a joint meeting with the Weed Science Society and the Ecological Society of America down in Fort Lauderdale, and that's the EMAPI meeting. It was in Hawaii one year, but that's the closest it's been to the U.S. since the one in Fort Lauderdale. The Neobiota Conference is an international conference on biological invasions. It's very European focused, and again, also I think is every 2 years. For almost 30 years now, USDA has hosted an interagency research forum on invasive species usually in the Annapolis, Maryland area. Unfortunately, this year I think was the first year that it did not happen because of the government shutdown. But I think plans are for it to continue in future years. This was originally a gypsy moth focused meeting that kind of morphed into all things invasive species. I mentioned Cannabio earlier in Mexico. Um, in Canada, there is a Canadian Council on Invasive Species, and then there's individual councils within each of the provinces, or most each of the provinces. And then there's other groups in Ontario. The Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters has a program that they're involved in. This Ontario's Invading Species Awareness Program. And so I just wanted to highlight a few of the things going on with in Canada and the councils, kind of their point group, as well as the individual councils. On a more regulatory side of things, in the U.S., the National Plant Board, as well as regional plant boards, are where a lot of the regulatory agencies, the Department of Ags, and the State Department of Ags and USDA APHIS will get together and work on issues. And then at the North American level, the North American Plant Pest Organization, NAPO, is where those conversations happen between the three countries. I wanted to point out, and thinking about different groups and that do different things on invasive species, I thought about, okay, who are some of the other groups, some of the private groups that are out there? And as I said at the beginning, I'm not endorsing any companies as part of this, but when I started thinking about involvement, the Innovations Conference is hosted with Invasive Plant Control Incorporated, and their president and vice president, Steve Manning and Lee Patrick, have been very involved and supportive of the exotic pest plant councils and the invasive plant councils through the years. And a lot of the efforts for those things would not have existed without some of their support. NASMA's current president is Kelly Cooley, who is a consultant in Alberta, Canada. He's been very involved in NASMA through the years, as well as the Alberta Invasive Species Council. Jim Burney, who has a company that's aquatic vegetation control in Florida, has been chair of the Florida Exotic Pest Plant Council, and also very involved in, working on a model of showing how these invasive species, building a group that he's calling Invasive Species Management Association. This starts in Florida initially to kind of talk to about the issue of the jobs and other things that supporting invasive species work provides. And that's been a great model, and it's all about the issue, not just promoting the companies. And Andy Canham from South Dakota, there was a group that came together on some different issues around the Missouri River, focused on invasive species, and he has served as chair of that group, and been very involved. And again, from a private contractor kind of focus. And I'm sure there's plenty of others. These were just four groups that I've crossed paths with a lot and have done a lot. When you start talking about these issues, invasive species, there's a lot of organizations that are not quote unquote invasive species organizations, but still, their members and what they talk about in a lot of cases are invasive species issues. So I wanted to highlight the Weed Science Society of America and some of their upcoming meetings, and the Aquatic Plant Management Society is another group that kind of works hand in hand with them on aquatic species. And then groups like Entomology Society of America, the American APS, which is the Plant Disease Organization, Ecological Society of America, Society for Range Management, Natural Areas Association, the Wildlife Society, the typical scientific societies, are all doing and having sessions and information about invasive species as part of what they do. And that's really continued to grow through the years as as the problem has gotten larger and larger. So, in summary, there's a whole bunch of groups out there, and like I said, I probably missed a ton, and feel free to email me all you want about them. But there's all these groups. They vary in different sizes, but I I think a lot of the work is done at that local level, and whether you call it a SISMA, a CWMA, or a PRISM, or whatever else you want to call it, it's that local effort, that flows down from these from the national and international groups down to these groups. And so, there's kind of this logical network. You have the federal agencies that exist at the top, and you can kind of put the large nonprofits, there as well. These are where a lot of the national scope, whether it's on the federal side and sometimes on the funding side from the federal agencies. And then you have the nonprofits that are out there and look at things, that kind of support the problem, support the professionals, support the agencies at that level. And then that kind of goes down to, from the government side, the state invasive species councils, which are made up of the state agencies that work together. And then, on kind of the more, when I think about invasive plant councils, those kind of groups that are truly the nonprofits that are more work at the state level, and then down to the local level with the SISMAs and the CWMAs and all. So, in an ideal world, if things, worked like they were supposed to, or like they would ideally work, there would be money flowing either up or down to projects on the local level where work can be done. There would be strategic planning done at the state level to make sure that there was some coordination at the larger landscape things. People would get together, figure out what needed to be done at that level, and some of this is happening. Don't get me wrong, to ensure that individual projects are done at the landscape level. There would be some way to map all of this work, both where the populations exist as well as where leading edges, to help better coordinate that. And this was a hard thing to put a slide to, but and then there would be some way that we all talk the same language when we're talking about even what we call it, or how we list it and how we say it's bad. Whether that's from the legal regulatory side of things, or whether that's from the group that just cares about the problem listing of things, making sure that we're all at least trying to use a universal way of doing things. So that brings me to the summary of all this, and as I said, a little bit of the more fun part of this. So bear with me here. So when you're thinking about these national or invasive species organizations, as we've seen, they exhibit rapid, uncontrolled growth. They're able to flourish in diverse different habitats. They're able to reproduce asexually by budding. They continue to grow. They can withstand long periods of dormancy. Some of these groups are more active sometimes, and others other times. And they can be highly competitive for very limited resources. And so, I think finally they seem to be somewhat resistant to control efforts. So, let's move forward with this, knowing that these are the characteristics of what these organizations look like, and let's try to, do prevention whenever possible. So if you're at a meeting and somebody starts talking about creating a new national invasive species organization, let's do what we can to prevent that from happening. That happens sometimes at other meetings of national invasive species organizations. It can happen on conference calls. It can happen at happy hours. It can happen all different kinds of places where we, can try to stop. Hey, no, well, maybe somebody's already doing that. Let's go talk to them. Maybe we don't need a new outreach campaign because we have Flake Clean Go and Clean Drain Dry and Don't Let It Loose and Don't Move Firewood. But if all else fails and we cannot prevent these new organizations, then that's when early detection, rapid response comes in. So if you're at a meeting and this gets proposed, look around the room, find the people who already exist to these other ones, and do your best to eradicate these new invasive species organizations before they can be established, and before we have another group out there, when we can support some of the groups that already exist. And I think that's the point of where I wanted to get today is, we hear all these acronyms. There's all these different groups out there. Some of them are doing really great work. I would even say most of them are doing great work. Some of them could be doing things better. But let's support what we have and figure out ways to make what we have work better, instead of, again, causing a new problem. So with that, here's my contact information. Feel free to email me, call me, send me ugly text, whatever, if I forgot about your organization. But I hope this was useful to everybody. And if anybody wants a copy of any of the slides, I'll be glad to share those with you. And I think the recording will be available to NASMA members on the NASMA website. So I guess I can look at the questions and see if there's any other questions that come in. Yes, one of the I will mention this, a conference that I left out was the Upper Midwest Invasive Species Conference. That group met with NASMA this past year, and it was a great meeting in Rochester, Minnesota, and they will be meeting again in Duluth, Minnesota, in 2020. And that last meeting, I think there was over 700 people there from 32 states, 4 provinces, and 4 countries. So a great meeting, and I apologize that it was left out of this. Yeah, so I almost hate to answer this question. So without naming names, can you give examples of types of effective great work activities and activities that are not as effective? Well, I guess I'll use the example of the Southeast Exotic Pest Plant Council. That group had been around for a long time. It was created to help build state organizations. It was created to foster coordination across the region. It was created to have an annual meeting and take some of the burden off of the state agencies, state organizations. And what happened was some of the state organizations grew and became very strong. Other state organizations didn't, and the strong ones didn't want to have a meeting with the Southeast because they wanted to be able to do their own thing. And then it became a problem of the Southeast Exotic Pest Plant Council was made up of the presidents of the state organizations. And if you're doing a good job in your state, you don't have the time to work with a different group. And so, it became obvious that there was no real need to have this regional organization, that we could focus on the state level or we could focus on the national level. So that was a recognition that even though there's a lot of history and a lot of love for what the Southeast EPSI has done, it wasn't needed anymore. I think that the coordination that's done through groups like the Western Weed Coordinating Committee meeting, the meeting with the states working together with the federal agencies in a room, there's great things that always come out of that organization. I think the work that's being done in the Everglades, even as big as the problem is, everybody works together. Everybody supports what each other's doing, and it's really a great example. So, yeah, I think that those are some of the examples. The conference that was in Minnesota last year, and getting 700 people in a room, into a conference together to talk about invasive species, that's a great program. Um, so, is there a single national organization that's responsible for coordinating state level regulations? Who do the state coordinators answer to? No, I mean, I the states are pretty much independent when it comes to that. I will say that the National Plant Board, which my understanding is I think it's a nonprofit, but it works to facilitate communication between the states, but it doesn't oversee what the states does. Um, so one of the agencies is being challenged to create a new EDRR process. um, you know, I guess again, I would say let's make sure we don't forget what has been done in the past. There's some good materials that Fickmanu put out originally, as well as there was a huge group that worked on an EDR framework not too many years ago, and so I would always say let's look at some of the existing materials that are out there before we start from scratch. I think there's definitely ways at the agency level that things can always be coordinated and work together. Um, and I would say, one example that has been successful is the exotic plant management teams within the Park Service. Those teams are able to, in a lot of cases, work on the parks that don't have some of the funding that the larger parks have, and are able to go in and help those parks out and kind of travel and kind of do some of that coordinated rapid response. Um, so state agencies are conflicted between management of invasive species and managing invasive species that sell hunting and fishing licenses, and protecting native species. Um, yeah, I don't know, that's a little bit outside of my expertise, but I can see that being a problem in cases, and I think that's where looking at some of the examples with the pythons and the hunting programs with the pythons in Florida. There's some good examples and some good work out there on the different, when hunting works, when hunting doesn't work, when hunting can be used to help regulate populations. Good example of a CWMA that's worked to control weeds in agricultural settings. So I mentioned that the state and county structure in the western states, and a lot of those western when they have projects that they work on across county boundaries, then they form weed management areas to tackle a problem, and so you know I, I can I can think that there's a lot of different groups, and I'd hate to point to one over another, but I know that there's being work done in most of those western states, across county when they have a problem, a landowner that has stuff across county boundaries, then they can really work together to to do things across those boundaries, related really to ag, and mostly grazing type problems, but ag plants along those lines. Um, yeah, and one of the comments was things are a lot of cases are focused on a lot of the SISMA work is focused mostly on plants, and that there's not as much of strike teams when it comes to animals or even forest problems. Um, but I think there's some opportunities for there, depending on how you manage the issues. I'll go back to the Everglades, where there are a lot of reptile problems and a lot of um, fish problems as well. And I think they've been able to be more creative and do things that would have been difficult to do within an individual organization by working as part of a regional organization, or like a SISMA or CWMA. Um, so, how can local managers support the development of this process? Who would we voice the need for a national coordination process and program? I mean, I think that working through some of these groups, like NASMA, and others, as well as at the state level, and at the federal level. I mean, a lot of the work requires funding, and it's the legislative branch, within the states and within the federal government that authorizes the funding, and having that funding usually allows things to happen a lot easier than without the funding. And so, encouraging people to work together and communicate what's going on, and tuning into webinars to find out about new ways or different ways people are doing things. As an educator, that's you got to have the education process, but at the end of the day, to really do the large scale landscape work, you've got to have the funding to go along with it as well. And so I think that's working through these different agencies, and as well as working up through working with the different organizations, and then working up through local agencies, depending on who the agency is in the area, is a good way to go. So um, so and I'll take the question, the last question, and then we'll wrap up. How can we get more money out? And I think I sort of answered that. Is not always on the agencies to do it. It's on Congress to authorize the money for the agencies to do it. And so I think that's the best way to move things and to keep things moving. So, well, thank all of y'all for tuning in. And now let's all get back to helping solve the problem versus talking about the problem.